When the British came to India, they had more than just conquest on their minds. They saw themselves as having a civilizing mission. But how do you go about changing an entire culture? This wasn't some dry policy debate. We're talking about a fierce ideological battle for the very soul of India. So, let's dive in and unpack how this incredible story unfolded.
But before we get into the thick of it, you might be wondering, what did school even look like in India back then? Well, a lot like this. This is a village pathshala, an open-air, super flexible system that was just woven into the fabric of local life. So the big question is, if this system was so connected to the community, why did the British feel they had to tear it all down? And what exactly did they want to build in its place?
All right, to get a handle on this radical transformation, here's our game plan. We'll start with that British civilizing mission, then watch the clash between two totally different visions for education. We'll see how a new system took over, find out what happened to those local schools, and finally, look at how Indians themselves pushed for a national education all their own.
Okay, first up, let's talk about the core idea that was driving this whole British project. It wasn't just about money and power. They genuinely believed they had a mission to civilize the natives, and that meant changing their customs and values from the ground up.
And this gets to a really crucial point. For the British, education wasn't just about learning for learning's sake. No, it was a tool of governance. The whole point was to create good subjects. But the big problem they faced was how? How do you actually do that? And the answer to that question sparked a massive debate.
So the first major approach came from a group we now call the Orientalists. Now these guys didn't see India as some kind of blank slate, not at all. They saw themselves as guardians of a rich, ancient culture that they believed had fallen from its former glory and needed to be rediscovered.
And honestly, this image just perfectly captures their whole vibe. This is William Jones, a judge and a brilliant linguist who came to Calcutta in 1783. He wasn't just sitting back and giving orders, he was immersing himself, spending hours every single day with Indian Pandits, diving deep into ancient texts on everything, from law and religion to science and medicine.
So, these were the Orientalists, British officials and scholars who developed a really deep, scholarly respect for the ancient cultures of India. They thought India's golden age was in its past, and they saw it as their job to help unearth it.
Their whole project was crystal clear. Find, translate, and promote this ancient Indian knowledge. They even put their money where their mouth was, setting up schools like the Calcutta Madrasa and Hindu College to encourage the study of Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit. The ultimate goal here? To become guardians of Indian culture, and in doing so, win the hearts and minds of the local people by valuing what they valued.
But not everyone was on board with this plan. A really powerful opposition group emerged, arguing that this entire Orientalist vision was a huge mistake. They saw Eastern knowledge not as glorious, but as unscientific and just full of what they called grave errors.
And the champion of this counter-argument was this man, Thomas Macaulay. He was sharp, influential, incredibly outspoken, and he had a completely different take. To Macaulay, India was an uncivilized country that desperately needed the civilizing influence of the West, period.
And nothing, and I really mean nothing, captures his view better than this just stunningly dismissive quote from 1835. For Macaulay, promoting Eastern learning was a complete and total waste of public money. He was adamant that the only real path forward was through the English language and Western knowledge. Well, Macaulay's passionate, fiery argument won the day. His famous Minute on Indian Education directly led to the English Education Act of 1835. And this, right here, was the turning point. English became the official language for higher education, and funding for all those Orientalist schools was stopped. The battle of ideas had a clear winner.
Okay, so the Anglicists won. What happens next? Well, a completely new education system starts to take shape, one built entirely on the foundation of European learning.
The final nail in the coffin for the whole Orientalist vision came in 1854 with a document we now call Wood's Despatch. It basically laid out the official education policy for India, and it went all in on European knowledge, pushing hard for its so-called practical benefits.
So what were these magical, practical benefits? Well, first, it was economic. The thinking was that exposing Indians to European goods and ways of life would create a whole new market for British products. Smart, huh? Second, administrative. It would produce a class of Indians who could work as reliable, low-cost civil servants. And third, there was this so-called moral benefit. It would make Indians truthful and honest and improve their overall character. And the results of this policy weren't just on paper. They were built in brick and mortar. In 1857, and get this, even as a massive rebellion was sweeping across northern India, universities were being set up in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, just like this one. They were these huge, concrete symbols of a new educational order modeled entirely on Western institutions.
But while all these grand universities were going up, what was happening back at the village level? What happened to those traditional pathshalas we saw at the very beginning? Well, their world was about to get turned completely upside down.
A report from the 1830s by a man named William Adam gives us this amazing snapshot of the old system. You're talking about over 100,000 pathshalas in Bengal and Bihar alone, and they were unbelievably flexible. Fees were based on what you could afford, teaching was all oral, and crucially, the schedule worked around rural life. It would pause during harvest time, so even kids from poor peasant families could go to school.
Now check out the contrast. After 1854, the British decided to improve this system by introducing order. And lots of it. Suddenly you've got government inspectors showing up, gurus have to submit regular reports, teaching is now based on textbooks, there are annual exams, fixed fees, and you have to show up on time every day. That old, organic flexibility was just completely erased and replaced by a rigid new structure. And the result? The schools that played by the new rules got government grants, those that didn't, well, they were just left to wither away.
But this story isn't just about what the British did. It's also about how Indians reacted. Because in response to this top-down colonial system, a really powerful call for a truly national education started to rise up from Indian thinkers themselves.
And Mahatma Gandhi? Well, he articulated this critique more forcefully than almost anyone. He argued that colonial education didn't free Indians, it enslaved them. It created a deep sense of inferiority, destroyed pride in their own culture, and made them feel like, in his words, strangers in their own lands. For him, it was pure poison.
And this wasn't just talk. Indian leaders were actively building alternatives. Here we see Gandhi with the great poet and thinker Rabindranath Tagore at Santiniketan, an incredible institution Tagore founded. The whole idea was to provide an education that was rooted in Indian culture and self-respect, blending the best of Indian and Western traditions, but on their own terms.
And this really brings us to the core tension of this entire story, a question that is still so incredibly relevant today. This whole battle for India's soul, fought in its classrooms, really leaves us with one final crucial question to think about. How can any society build for the future without completely erasing its past?